بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Salam, hello, peace to you all. I'm Adnan Hussein, and I have some exciting news for you about this upcoming series, of which this is the first episode that I'm introducing. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about this series. It's called History in the Time of Genocide Denial, Palestine and the World. It's a 7-part series about the history of Israel-Palestine. It begins, broadly speaking, with the Crusades and Islamophobia and anti-Semitism through to Ottoman history, but then really gathers steam when we come to the 19th century, and it traces and discusses the relationships between Jewish nationalism and Palestinian resistance in the history of the region broadly, from Eastern Europe to the Eastern Mediterranean. So I think you're going to find it a very interesting series. It's basically a dialogue, in some cases, mini lectures, from my friend and esteemed colleague, Dr. Ariel Salzmann, who was teaching a course last fall about this very subject. After discussing with her approach and what kinds of arguments she makes about how to reframe the question of Palestine, I thought it would be really useful to make this available in some form to a wider audience and not just her students in that particular class. So we recorded in December for many, many hours and had some wonderful discussions and a great dialogue where she had the opportunity to summarize some of her key points in this history from her course. In certain cases, she refers to slides. Unfortunately, we weren't able to share screen when we were recording, and it proved too cumbersome to find where we could splice these slides in. So there's a visual component that she sometimes was referring to that isn't available to you, but no worries. Her descriptions and analysis of these certainly will give you a sense of what was being referred to. So just ignore the references to the slides. But I do think you're going to find this a very, very useful and important resource in thinking about the question of Palestine. And although we recorded in December, and since that time now it's March in 2025, there have been a lot of very important developments. In fact, you could say that the ongoing situation is constantly writing a new chapter in this story that we need to engage with and analyze. But I think this longue durée history and background will give you very valuable resources and tools for conceptualizing and contextualizing the genocide that's been taking place in Gaza. Now, as I mentioned, this is a 7-part series. If you're watching on YouTube, this is the first episode, and you should look out for more episodes unfolding over the course of the upcoming weeks. In 7 weeks' time, you will complete the series. And likewise, if you're an audio podcast listener, you also will have an episode each week for the coming period of time. However, if you would like to listen to all of them all at once, in one go, you're the kind who likes to binge watch or binge listen, you can have access to all of them. At this time, they're available for Patreon supporters and subscribers. You can go to patreon.com/Adnan Hussein, ADNAN HUSAIN, become a paid subscriber, and you will have access to these immediately to start listening to, learning from, and enjoying. Of course, these will be available. This is an important resource. It'll be available to everyone in due course, unfolding as a serial series taking place over the next couple of months. Anyway, I hope you will enjoy this series and enjoy this first episode. Until the next episode, salam, peace, and solidarity to you all. So, welcome everyone to this very exciting series of conversations and lectures, essentially, that will be boiled down into what I think is going to be a very useful and fascinating series on the situation in Palestine, its historical background, and with us to take us through this is Dr. Ariel Salzmann, close friend, cherished colleague here at Queen's University, who has been teaching a course on exactly this subject and has offered to come and share her knowledge and wisdom and her unique analysis about how to reframe a lot of the discussion through a different and more global perspective on the history of Palestine and the region. So I'm really delighted, Ariel, that you could join us for this, series, this extended series. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Adnan. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm glad we're doing this. It's so important at this moment in time to both tell what's going on now, which is really horrific. We are living and teaching in a time of genocide. It goes on. The television cameras have switched to other parts of the Middle East, to Syria, to Lebanon, but every day dozens and dozens of people are killed. They're killed in North Gaza. They're killed where they're seeking refuge in central and southern parts of Gaza. Again, we don't, the camera turns on and off. The brave journalists in Gaza, the citizen journalists of Gaza, 150 of whom have been killed, keep trying to keep us focused on what's going on. But it is a time of genocide, and it makes our responsibilities as educators, as academicians, it gives them a new importance, but also a new heavy weight that we bear with our students who bravely come to these classes in a time of silencing and censorship.
Well, on that note, I think you had wanted to dedicate this series to a scholar and an activist from South Africa that whose case really exemplifies not only the interconnections between these two settler colonial societies and the struggles for their liberation, but also what you just mentioned, which is that we are also living both at the university and in wider society during a time also of censorship and suppression of academic freedom and political speech when dealing particularly with this topic. And so I wondered if maybe you could talk a little bit about to whom you're dedicating this series.
Yeah, I'd like to dedicate this to Fred Dubet. Fred Dubet was a young academic. He was a recent academic, had been hired by Stony Brook University. He was a psychologist. He had been in prison in Robben Island in South Africa, and had done his PhD at Cornell University in psychology, and was teaching a course on racism, on the psychology of racism. And he dedicated one of his lectures to basically what he called reactive racism. And there he gave two examples. One was what was happening in Palestine, and the role of Israeli Jews, some of whom were survivors of the Holocaust, or had family members who died in the Holocaust, and who were redirecting racism toward Palestinians. He saw that dehumanization then. He also saw it among his colleagues in the ANC, in the African National Congress. So he was criticizing them as well as being reactively racist toward whites for what they had suffered. And for his honesty and his foresight, he would be punished. There was a visiting scholar who took his syllabus, showed it to the authorities, ended up going to the Board of Trustees, one of whom was the current Secretary Blinken's father, the Jewish community, and there was basically a witch hunt against him. They made life impossible. They called him an anti-Semite. And as the New York Times announced in 1987, this was 1983, so this was shortly after Israel's horrific invasion then of Lebanon. In 1987, he would then be denied tenure. Truthfully, I do not know what happened to Fred Dubet, but We feel, all of us now, and then kindred spirits and ashamed. I personally, as a Jewish person, that anti-Semitism is used to silence, but not only silence. In this particular context, it is a form of genocide denial. The invocation, the false invocation of anti-Semitism, is actually a form of genocide denial.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for telling us about Fred Dubet. And, we're making this as a resource for people who want to find out more about the history and the politics involved, particularly of those histories of racism that I think we're going to be talking about quite a bit in this initial episode. But before we get into talking about that kind of set of issues about Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, these kinds of questions, very often when discussing Israel-Palestine or the question of Palestine, the framework is very limited in terms of the geographies and the interconnections with a larger regional picture and from global perspectives. And even the region is often called, the Middle East conflict. And there are other ways of framing and talking about the region, Southwest Asia, Middle East, North Africa, and so on. But one of the problems has been typically is thinking about this just as a national struggle and of two, over the status of a nation state. And in general, when you take a longer Durée look at history, you see the artificiality and, in some senses, some of the destructive consequences of the formation of a nation state that often produces a sort of history or a perspective on history that's very limiting and cuts off a lot of the analytical possibilities for really reframing identities, struggles, politics, and so on. And so I wanted to ask you, in your work and in your way of thinking about these issues, I know you like to think outside the nation state box, and wondering what other approaches you like to use in framing your communications, lectures, and discussions with students about how to approach what we call the Middle East, but outside the nation state box.
It's interesting because I think in the Middle East itself, there's been a rethinking. You yourself did a conference on the caliphate and thinking about the dissolution of the caliphate in 1924. Well, there's been a lot of soul searching, I know, in the Middle East and broadly about what happened to the Ottoman Empire. Could the Ottoman Empire have been a model that would have carried the Middle East into the 20th, 21st century? And so my perspective is grounded in my own training as an Ottoman historian. And I think, when we look at the window of history that defines the nation state, it's rather short with respect to the multi-religious empires that existed before that, and not just in the Middle East, but also within Europe. And those empire states or multi-ethnic, multi-religious states were actually undergoing transformations in the late 19th century. I'll talk more about that. But they were undergoing some very interesting transformations that may have led to a very different outcome. And so thinking about the nation state has locked us into, whether it's, Zionist historiography, Israeli historiography, or for that matter, Palestinian historiography, has locked us into a teleology, a teleological framework, which makes the endpoint for self-determination only in terms of a nation state. And so one sees very detailed, very important work by many Palestinian scholars about this subject, but nonetheless missing, I think, important conjunctures when things might have turned otherwise. And in this, I was inspired and influenced by a very well-known Indian historian, Rata Kumar, who chastised me one time. I had a conference at NYU and said, I don't want to talk about what happened. I want to talk about those moments when things could have been otherwise. And I think the the most successful models that came after I think, and again, we'll talk about one of those, the Greater Syria, the effort to create a Greater Syria, were modeled not on the nation state as it was formed in Europe, but rather grew out of the Ottoman experiment. The Ottoman experiment went sour. It was destroyed in the end by nationalists, actually, by Turkic nationalists. But there was an Ottoman experiment that tried to bring together people as citizens of a multi-religious state, if not a multi-ethnic, but it was composed of people of different ethnicities and languages. So I think, there's two reasons to break out of the nation state. One is this teleology that makes it inevitable that that's the only place for self-determination rights, human rights, minority rights to go. And the second is to remember that there were moments and there are moments in history when things could have taken another turn that might have led to more broad-based liberation, the dignity of all people, and of course, broad-ranging human rights and respect for not only human beings, but our environment as well.
Yes, well, I'm really looking forward to hearing about some of those episodes that you think are those important turning points in Ottoman history. But just back to this kind of question of the nation state box, I think it's a really important two issues that you raised about it. And it makes me remember the fact that, of course, I mean, the nation state in this region is, not a product of some kind of organic historical development. I mean, the kinds of political structures that typically had existed were not nation states in the Middle East, throughout its long period of history. And it's as a result of empires or larger scale kinds of units of political affiliation and organization that made a place, a region that is so much of a crossroads, for transit and trade, that also fostered cosmopolitan variety and difference. Those very mixed populations that don't resolve themselves very successfully, you might say, into a narrow nation state type project, and that this is something that's, of course, very important for other regions in world history where there were empires like the Russian Empire or even Eastern Europe, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so on. And the era of the nation state has, as a result, caused a lot of political conflicts and difficulties in which we might situate as we go forward some of the events and some of those turning points. And the other point about these turning points and endings, not just what happened, but where those turning points were and what they say about the possibilities for how things could have been otherwise and trajectories towards different futures that we want to potentially recover or at least think through. It also puts pressure really on where does one start one's analysis, not the origins necessarily, but the beginnings, the beginning point for a historical narrative. And so maybe as the opening, after that introduction about the framework, getting beyond the nation state box in terms of our historical approaches to the Middle East, the question is where does one start the story? Where does one begin, knowing that it's not necessarily the origin and there could be other beginning points, but each beginning point, unfolds a new vantage and how to reframe and think about these histories and the contemporary legacies that we're dealing with. And so I'm wondering, maybe we might turn to a longue durée sort of appreciation of the question of Palestine and the histories into which it is situated. So how far back should we go, at least in your sense of analysis, to have a relevant context for thinking about some of the processes and problems that frame the question of Palestine and the question of Zionism?
I think this is where the nation state begins its distortion. Certainly, for Zionism, it's looking back 5,000 years to an ancient Israel and scouting for those remains to lay claim 2,000 years later or 3,000 years later to a territorial claim. And of course, Palestine is no ordinary piece of real estate, but one has to center beyond these ancient kingdoms, Assyrians, the ancient kingdoms, the Jewish kingdoms, the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, that for the longest period of time, we're talking about a place that has been a spiritual home and not a national home. And it, became a spiritual home to three religions, over 1,000 years ago. And more offshoots. We can talk about Baha'i and offshoots of Islam. So it's a spiritual homeland for many peoples, and at least three of the world's largest religious communities have affinities for that place and have holy sites in that place. So as such, it's not just a question that it was absorbed into a variety of different empires, but it had several layers of existence that we tend to forget. And that kind of affinity, that kind of religious affinity, spiritual affinity, was felt by peoples all over the world, both sides of the Mediterranean, across North Africa, going into, of course, Asia and Central Asia, without territorializing that sentiment. And this is true, especially for the Jews. I mean, it's very, very interesting to see how in the 19th century or even earlier, that the symbol of Jerusalem, you can find it on a lot of places, is actually the Dome of the Rock. I mean, that's the standing architectural feature that symbolizes Jerusalem. And again, it is a spiritual homeland, and it's this layers of spirituality on top of the central area. And I believe your research too, Adnan, on the Holy Fire and the way that communities accommodated one another but participated in one another's sense of holiness and religiosity is a fantastic example of moments, and probably for the longer period of the last 2,000 years, of mutuality and sharing of tombs, of holy figures, whether it's in Hebron, Khalil, or whether it's other parts in Aleppo and other parts where Muslims, Christians, and Jews would worship at the same places. But in the case of the Holy Fire, where Christians and Muslims participated in a very important ritual of Christianity, perhaps you could say some more about that as an example.
I think you're absolutely right that it's an excellent example of something that was a larger phenomenon of shared holy spaces, practices, memories, pilgrimage sites, and so on, because of a shared common connection of their monotheistic theology, but more than that, of their sense of valuing a similar, historical or religious historical salvation history of biblical patriarchs and prophets who are as much and importantly significant for Muslims as well, right? So that's a kind of wider and broader phenomenon that made the sacred geography, you might say, something that was shared and had those multiple layers that you're talking about. The actual miracle of the Holy Fire, I think, begins with actually an attempt to, as a compensation for the loss of exclusive religious sovereignty over the city when it was under the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire's control. And it was a Christian city. And for hundreds of years, there was a policy of excluding Jews from living in Jerusalem. And when Muslims conquered, the Arab Muslims conquered under, the famous Caliph Omar in the 630s, there changed a policy to open it up, not only, of course, to Muslims as sovereigns of this holy city that had been a qibla or direction of prayer for Muslims early on, before Mecca became the direction towards which all Muslims prayed. And also, of course, it had been the site of a spiritual journey that's very important in Muslim devotional contexts and literatures.
but it was also opened up to Jews again for the first time in hundreds of years. And this, of course, produced all kinds of anxieties because there was a sort of theological investment in Christian supersessory salvation history of displacing the Jews. So it ended up being a multi-religious city again, and having that for several hundreds of years. And the Holy Fire miracle was something like a miracle that was meant to symbolize spiritually the resurrection of Jesus. So the lights that normally are extinguished in the church during the Easter celebrations are then relit on Sunday, liturgically speaking, with a new fire, a fire that's newly kindled to symbolize, the rebirth or resurrection of Jesus. In the Holy Sepulchre, in the Church of the Resurrection, by contrast, that liturgical practice of extinguishing the lights was relit by a miraculous holy fire that descended, right? And this is a miracle that seems only to have emerged in the context of the post-Muslim conquest of the city. And it was something like a way of still asserting some kind of spiritual connection and sovereignty over their holy places, that even if this city was now no longer an exclusively Christian city, and maybe even more importantly, a Christian governed city, that nonetheless, Christ reigned supreme on some level, right? But over time, what's so fascinating about it is that pressure, you might say, of spiritually shared space ends up turning Muslims who have no theological commitment to the resurrection of Jesus, turn this miracle into something that becomes part of the local Jerusalem popular religious experience. And so they start participating and attending. And even the emir of the city, we have documentation that shows that the emir of the city and the imam of the Aqsa Mosque participated in the performance of the holy fire. They guarded the tomb once it was closed up, and once the fire arrived, they were the first to verify that the holy fire had arrived, and fascinatingly, were the first to light their lamps and then take the holy fire and light the lamps of Al-Aqsa with it. So it shows that there was multiple layers of shared spiritual engagement and connection. What's interesting when you talked about the overlapping and shared spiritual homeland, or the idea that it was a sacred space to multiple religions and the consciousness of this, while there was always, of course, some competition, and even the miracle itself is born of, in my argument and analysis, out of some kind of polemical response to the loss of political and spiritual sovereignty, that what changes really fundamentally in this history, and maybe this is a good beginning point for our discussion, is when it became territorialized in a new way. And this is the thing that is so profound about the Crusades and the new era that emerges, which is that, there were some early disparaging remarks. Anselm of Canterbury, very famous and important kind of theologian and philosopher, who became Archbishop of Canterbury, but was known, for his writings, and a famous proof of God, people even in history of philosophy departments still study today. He said Jerusalem is a spiritual place. The earthly terrestrial Jerusalem doesn't matter. I mean, this is a heavenly Jerusalem that we're attempting to connect to. And of course, we go and we visit and go on pilgrimage so that we can be reminded of that history. But he was opposed to the territorializing of the Christian imagination of their inheritance of Jerusalem, to it being an earthly territorial kingdom that needed to be founded and controlled exclusively by Christians. He said it's a spiritual homeland, as you were saying before. However, what the Crusades did was they asserted a historic, ancient right of control over the land as a territory, which is something that should remind us a little bit when we're thinking of resurrecting ancient claims of history for a sacred territory. that has to be territorially bound, not necessarily bounded, but it has to be controlled as a territory, and that you have to have religiously based political sovereignty over the land itself, rather than, it being a kind of more abstract spiritual engagement and connection to that land. This is the outcome of the Crusades entirely, is that they took a kind of biblical history themselves and argued that because they had displaced the Hebrews and the Israelites, and because those Jewish kingdoms had been destroyed around the time of the era of the coming of Christ, and the Jews had gone into exile and diaspora, that therefore the Christian community had displaced, and not just at a spiritual level, but now they had displaced them, and that they themselves were the new Hebrews, and that they should actually take precedent and examples of David as a kingly ruler, not just as an emblem of Christian kingship, but actually they should rule over those lands, and that it was an affront that they were in the hands of non-Christians, something that motivated the Crusades. If one looks at Urban II's announcing of the Crusades in 1095, this is the kind of idea that is being propounded. And, also there is a corresponding idea that it is both the spiritual homeland, and it is also a land without a legitimate people there. It is a land of milk and honey that is waiting to be restored through Christian sovereignty over it, and cleansed of the impure and polluting presence of the non-Christians, usually characterized as pagans, of course, because they didn't have a kind of concept in the earliest period of the theology of Islam that it was a monotheistic religion. Gradually, they came to understand that, but this initial idea is that it's being polluted by a pagan defilement, and it needs to be cleansed, and it needs to be territorialized as Christian sovereign space.
But it also the Crusades becomes the model for future colonization globally.
Absolutely. That's
right?
definitely
So
the point. Yeah.
dehumanization, the turning of indigenous inhabitants into, heathen, pagan, who can either be killed or converted or enslaved. And the Crusader message, it's the Crusader license to kill, to enslave, to conquer, and to loot, which becomes basically the terms for the transatlantic expansion in the 1450s. These are all neo-Crusader, licenses issued by the papacy. All with the idea of bounding Christendom against the other. And within that new boundaries of Christendom, the other can be subject to, all sorts of, horrors and expropriation and expulsions, etc. So the Crusades are this microcosm of early colonization. They don't succeed. And what follows in its wake, of course, is a reassertion of the Islamicate, what Marshall Hodgson called a society in which Muslims rule, but which accommodates, and we don't say it's a utopia, but definitely accommodates non-Muslims under its rule. And Saladin is the one who revived that. He does something completely different after the First Crusades. The First Crusades, as you well know, slaughtered everybody. Muslims and Jews were slaughtered for purification of Jerusalem. When Saladin comes, he doesn't slaughter the people. He doesn't turn the Holy Sepulchre into a stable, as the Crusaders had done with Muslim and Jewish holy places, right? And instead, he makes that he brings the Jews back. He calls them back to Jerusalem to resettle in Jerusalem, and he starts again to practice what had been in place before the Crusaders, which is to open Jerusalem as a site of pilgrimage for all faiths. And the Ottomans continue this.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's important to see the contrast between the Crusader idea of purified, even though, of course, they couldn't actually eliminate the indigenous inhabitants. Of course, they actually also needed them to exploit their labor, and you pointed out that they enslaved
Well, outside the
many.
city, but the
Yeah,
farmers,
outside the
the
city, but
falafel,
the point
yeah.
was that there were certain spaces that did have to be pure Christian spaces, and also there was a legitimation of that kind of genocidal production of a pure Christian space. That was authorized by the Crusades and was very much at variance with the characteristics of Mediterranean society. Both of us are people who like to characterize ourselves as Mediterranean historians, and typically what I think one means by that is talking about the paradigms and patterns by which you have multiple faiths and ethnic linguistic groups finding a way to collectively live and produce and work and so on, and so it's this kind of diverse, multi-religious and multi-ethnic and multi-linguistic kind of space that is typical, and finding ways to normalize this as just a part of the societies in the Mediterranean that the Crusader states, and increasingly what happens in Europe. And one could argue that it is, in fact, actually the project of crusade and crusading, and then the experience within the Crusader states as an early settler colonial project that, as you pointed out, didn't ultimately succeed, but was the incubation for practices and policies and ideas that not only repattern Europe's kind of relationship to its own minorities and the problem of religious difference, but then gets exported as a method and a mechanism of more global world conquest and colonization, with major legacies for global history that I'm sure we could talk about. But I did want to ask you a little bit about the status of Jews in we were talking a little bit about these ideas of finding, I think, as a prelude to really analyzing and reframing, what Zionism is and, how it, comes about, this idea of territorializing a spiritual homeland comes, in the 19th century out of the context of a much longer history of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish sentiment and persecution that we could certainly connect back to the processes we were talking about. Maybe not a sort of simple line, but if we want to, have a beginning point, the Crusades are actually the context, and the preaching of the First Crusade and every subsequent major crusade is the context for major outbursts of anti-Jewish violence. The First Crusades rather famously involved huge massacres of Jews, not only in the Rhineland, but most famously in the Rhineland, but other parts of Western Europe, and then on the pilgrimage route of the armies on their way overland through South and Eastern, Central and then Southeastern Europe, is slaughtering Jewish communities along the way as they plundered and actually committed violence against their Eastern, Orthodox Christians and so on. But that, there's a real intimate and deep connection of a long period of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish violence that is connected to crusade and crusading, which is, of course, the paradigmatic form of anti-Muslim violence and warfare. So I'm wondering if we would talk maybe a little bit about something like a major problem that you've recognized and noticed in a lot of the discussions today about anti-Semitism that try and erase this longer history and displace it and transpose it upon the Palestinians in order to justify for a European audience, for the Western audience, a similar displacement of amnesiac, forgetting of an active amnesia of forgetting the deep and long roots of the persecution of religious minorities, and particularly Jews inside of Europe, as a fundamental and long-lasting feature of European history, with lots of political kinds of consequences. So when there is something you've called Holocaust deflection, it has these deep roots. I'm wondering if you would want to discuss and comment about how that
Well, if you think
transformed and
about
metamorphosed.
the way that, I mean, and there is a discussion that racism is not a modern phenomenon. Racism goes back at least to the medieval period. And there are scholars who look at, Greek and Roman authors, in terms of what they see about Africa. But in terms of the sort of very specific interface between anti-Jewish prejudice within Western Europe and Christendom more broadly, but it takes a very acute form in Western, in the Latin Christian West, and Islam. There is this paradigm of the other that is created out of anti-Judaism, that is ethnic, that is racial, in which Jews and Muslims are racially tied, in which Jews and Muslims and Jews and early visions of Islam are also extended as an ethnic formation, in the sense that they both practice circumcision, they have dietary rules, all the things that Paul eschewed, that he said, Christians don't have to do. These are, in catering to the Gentiles. We don't need these what are called the carnal aspects of Judaism. We're going to renounce them. And they saw those in Islam and Judaism. So out of this hybrid of Islamo-Judaism, we find these stereotypes that are ethnic and racial. They're considered ethnically, racially, or in terms of their genealogical heritage. Jews and Muslims are considered to be of the same stock.
From
And
Shem. That's right.
Yeah. So there's a paradigm of otherness that comes out of this amalgamation of the two. And of course, seeing Islam as the greater threat, however, as Jews as their partners. And so, it's not just that, there's opportunism involved in terms of looting and pillaging and killing off communities en route to the Crusades, because many of the Crusaders were self-funded. So they went after, whatever wealth they thought
And
they
it's
could
not like
legitimately.
there was logistics,
Yeah,
when they're
exactly.
in Hungary and
Infrastructure.
Eastern Germany. Yeah. So
Right.
that's right.
So, but there was a legitimacy to doing it, insofar as these were considered not only, relatives of the Muslims on these various levels, but also, as would be the accusation for much of the medieval and early modern period, that they were actively in collaboration with Muslims. I mean, Genoa would, every time there was a war, with North Africa, the Jews would get expelled. And at the very end of the Crusades, and this is something I note in the book that's forthcoming, is in the 1290, after the fall of Acre, there's a rash of expulsions that take out Jewish communities, the Jewish community of England that had been there for centuries. Across France, they're expelled 1306. But of course, also the destruction of Lucera, the last Muslim village or town within Italy itself, and within Sicily and southern Italy, in 1300. And there is a connection there. There's a connection, the fall of Acre, and Dante makes it very clear. And he talks about, Jews and Muslims being in cahoots, and them being the beneficiaries of the fall of the last Crusader outpost. And at that point, the connection is theological. The connection is in terms of ethno-racial, if you will. It's religious, and now it's become increasingly economic.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. We should talk about the
Yeah.
economic in a moment, but I did want to go back to that point of how the racialization and ethnicization of religious difference starts to take place already in these very early periods. They're not fully distinguished. And of course, in talking about the history of racism, we do want to acknowledge that there's different ideas of ethnicity. Modern race is a bit of a, the scientific construct and so
Scientific race.
on. And they're not always always easily distinguishable, but there is the slippage that is relevant and the ambiguity of the nature of difference that sometimes was imagined that it could be cured, as it were, and altered through conversion. But increasingly over the period of the Middle Ages, there's less and less willingness to think of a Jewish convert to Christianity as somehow having abandoned their Jewishness in some way. You know, the immutability of the Jew becomes something that you find ideas about that. You find practices that suggest that it's impossible. And of course, these are very important when it comes to large scale or mass conversions, where, you know, you have a whole host or a whole group and community that has been forcibly converted or converted under massive missionizing pressure and threats of violence, that of course this undermines the idea that conversion religiously was enough to really integrate and assimilate people. And so lines of difference tend to move then to culture, ethnicity, and ultimately to racial points. But the circumcision it's a fascinating point to note, that of course, because Islam and Judaism both have this practice, you know, stemming, you know, from, you know, it's the covenant. The covenant is established, right? You know, Abraham establishes conversion. And so it's a very liberating, you know, Paul, when he says, you know, be circumcised in the spirit and not in your body. It's that rejection of a kind of bodily and ethnic kind of understanding and identity of Christianity as something different from Judaism, and a rejection of it. But, you know, in the Urban II's propaganda and preaching the Crusades to motivate, you know, religious enthusiasm for the violence to come, it's very interesting that the connection is made, even though he doesn't explicitly characterize them as Jews or similar to Jews. He's, of course, trafficking in this sense that they are pagans, and thus they are an ethnicity of their own, you know, a kind of other that comes from culture, ethnicity, rather than a religiously based difference, you know, besides idolatry versus monotheism. But this idea that there are a people, a nation, pagan people, a nation. He does talk about their circumcisions, and that they use the blood of forcibly circumcising Christians who are martyrs, and recalling early Christian history and trying to frame contemporary events within that late antique, early origin story of Christianity as persecuted by this major, you know, powerful empire, and that they are victims. And it's always very important to see the way in which victimization is being mobilized here. That they forcibly circumcised Christian youth, and then defiled holy altars with the blood of circumcision. So it's just such a bodily kind of disgust that is also being mobilized and provoked in the audience, that is part of seeing the difference, even in bodily terms. And it's the idea that we have to save our Eastern Christian brethren because they are like us in body, you know, the Christ's body, because they share the Eucharist and they have similar liturgical you know, moment in the liturgy, in the Mass, that we are of one body. That I would suggest and argue that this is on the path to a kind of ethnicization itself of Christianity. So at the one time that they're marking the difference as a proto-ethnic and racial division with the non-Christian, they are at the same time starting to really create a sense of the ethnic identity of Latin Western Christians that is on the path to a physical or, you know, bodily or racial, you know, kind of whiteness as the marker of difference. And so I think that's very important when we, you know, are thinking about the complex of ideas and practices that are
Well, it also
mobilizing
it's part
different.
of the intervention, the motives of intervention that show that line of continuity from the Crusades onward to the 19th century,
Well, it's a
to the early
humanitarian
20th.
intervention, you know? I mean,
Exactly,
it's the right to
but
protect,
directed
responsibility to
only
protect.
toward the right to protect, but only toward like
That's right.
Christians.
That's right.
And so that will be, the demise of, that will be the excuse the French used in the 1920s to terminate an experiment in democracy and multi-religious democracy in Syria.
Yes. Well, we're going to have to get to
save
that subject.
Christians. So
Yeah.
but there are these lines of continuity. So you've got that nucleus of colonization, which includes, of course, preventing those people who were formerly Jews or of Jewish stock or of Muslim stock from going to the Americas. This is very clear in the early colonization effort. And when people talk about the expulsion of the Moriscos, they are indelibly Muslims. They cannot become Christians. And the same thing with the conversos. I mean, there was a different way of dealing with them in 1492, which was to get rid of the last of the unconverted, in the hope that the mass conversion of Jews that had happened in the 1390s could be contained, and they would fully Christianize. But as you noted, Jews could never be fully Christians. Disraeli could never be fully Christian. So there was no way to shed it. It had the past, the ethnicity, the religio-ethnic identity had become racialized and a part of heredity. It was no longer simply a something you took on. Conversion, was a far more complex animal at this point. But the other thing I wanted to mention before I talk a little bit about what would happen during the Ottoman period, and I have, you'll see later a slide up about the way that Ottoman Sephardim portrayed the mass exodus from Spain toward the Ottoman Empire, and the fact that Bayazid II would welcome them in as a sort of, as a savior, as a new Cyrus even. But I think that we have to think about the second part of this, which is what happens with Protestantism, and how Protestantism, the roots of Christian Zionism, are then born in the 17th century, and very distinct from the sort of older Christian Catholic way of seeing Palestine. And there in the 17th century, what you get with a lot of these splinter groups, the Puritans, the Fifth Monarchists and stuff, you get this new philo-Semitism that's emerging in England in the 17th century, which actually sees, again, with this notion that we are the new Jews, we are the new Hebrews, but also foresees this transformation that requires the Jews to return to a territorialized Palestine. One that is separate from and outside of the Muslim realm. And this beginning of this support for these early proto-Zionist projects, including that of Shabtai Tzvi, the false messiah in the middle of the 17th century, who actually had this project of trying to form a new Jewish kingdom. Of course, he would be the head of it, and claimed that, he broke off from the traditional Judaism. He had enormous amounts of followers around the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe, and would eventually end up converting to Islam and create a sort of subsect of Islam, what were called derogatively the Durée, but the followers of Shabtai Tzvi. But his program was widely followed in the Protestant world because he sought to refound some sort of Jewish political presence, a breakaway state within the Ottoman Empire, of course, connected with this messianic notion. But there you find, again, in the pre-modern period we're talking about, so you find the early elements of settler colonialism, the project, racialization, the close connection between a Jewish Muslim other, with all these sort of features, and they will be connected well into the 20th century, of this relationship, or at least till the end of the 19th century. And then finally, during the early modern period, this other notion of a sort of Jewish Protestant alliance in order to create a breakaway new Jewish state, which serves the interests of this evangelical or proto-evangelical Christian notion of end times and rebirth, etc.
Right, right. Now, that's a very interesting issue, maybe for people to really appreciate what is changing and what's different about this kind of concept that proves to be extremely important and influential on the subsequent history of, as you're pointing out, Christian Zionism and its support for other forms of Zionism. Is that what it reverses is the idea of the Augustinian, doctrine of witness that understood Jewish presence almost universally around the globe as providing the theological and technical, you might say, basis for establishing the truth of Christianity globally, because
a theological truth as
that's
opposed
right,
to
that their
a territorial.
disbursement around the world actually helped prove the truth of a spiritual reading of the Old Testament, as they called it, of the Hebrew Bible, that validated Christian faith and Christian salvation theology. That they themselves couldn't see it because they were very carnal and they didn't have this spiritual reading, and they'd missed the historical boat. Talk about turning points where things could have been different. They missed the boat in recognizing Jesus as the Messiah. And as a result, they were then condemned into this position of being frozen outside of history and time, maintaining the literal truth and the literal text of the Hebrew Bible that, of course, now needed to be read in light of Christ as having all of this, spiritual, readings and allegories that they themselves bore witness to, even if they themselves could not see it. And so there was a useful function for the Jewish diaspora, for that post-biblical, post-Jewish kingdom, post-Jewish sovereignty position. And in fact, there was the idea that they had lost sovereignty, and was very important for Jews in various ways over the course of the next millennia to establish that there still were emblems and moments and experiences of sovereignty that would be reconstituted, and in order, as a polemic against the Christian theological idea that the loss of the Jewish kingdoms meant that forever they would not be a people constituted as a nation with a kingdom or with political power and political sovereignty, because that had been displaced now by the Christian era, and that the end times would be a result of an ingathering, but as part of their elimination and conversion, right? So this is the kind of doctrine of the old Catholic theology that tolerated Judaism and Jews as subordinate servants to Christians in society, and also serving this kind of useful function of demonstrating to the rest of the world that Christianity has to be true, because the evidence is there in the Hebrew Bible that proves Christian salvation doctrines. So it's interesting there's a lot of things that change, obviously, with Protestantism, but usually this position, this way, it's about faith, not works. It's no indulgences. It's about, your spiritual, kind of election, or, it's about the scripture alone and not these intervening commentaries of Catholic, theologians and their doctrines, but going back sola scriptura, getting rid of a Catholic mass and rituals, and making fun of, hocus pocus, hocus corpus meum. So very often the discussion about what Protestantism is in its rejection of Catholicism. In other words, a heresy. There had been other heresies, a heresy that comes to be its own sect because it's successful. For a long time, of course, the Counter-Reformation was just still trying to say that these are just heretics who need to be suppressed if we can. But that's usually framed within this kind of very theological idea about Christian doctrinal questions,
But that's
matters,
true.
and
That's
practices.
true with Calvinism and Luther. But it's not true by the 17th century with these new
Well, that's what's
Protestant
interesting. What
just
happens to
splintering off. Yeah.
create these kinds of movements that really reframe the Christian relationship to Jews in
And they
salvation?
are very influential. They will be very influential in the 19th and early 20th century. Not that they want an ingathering. I mean, Cromwell will readmit the Jews, right? So it's during that time of the upheaval, before, the end of the 19th century when Jews are, in the middle of the century, which coincides with, of course, Shabtai Tzvi's movement, which they follow very closely, British Protestants or English Protestants. But it'll be influential throughout the 19th century in promoting a territorialization of Palestine involving Jews, where the Jews become the stepping stone for the eventual, messianic age, and that literally, but they'll be seen as allies in another project. And the way that the British, there's some really interesting studies now, especially intervening, where Catholics are there backing in parts of the Middle East, the Maronites, or even parts of the Armenian, because they're Armenian Catholics. The British will find the other groups of Christians, whether it's Greek Orthodox, and in Lebanon, it's Druze, and in North Africa, it's Jews, as their wedge issues into colonial positions. So defending Jewish rights in certain circumstances, the British in Lebanon allying with the Druze as opposed to the French who are allying with the Christians, Maronites in particular. And so this will all be tied in with a sort of minoritization of the way that imperialism plays out in later periods, but it'll have these deep roots in the 17th century with a type of Christian Zionism, Protestant Christian Zionism, that's emerging, that in some cases is favorable to Jews coming into England and participating in English society. In other cases, as an instrument into territorializing, colonizing Palestine, as part of that project, apart from, the general ideas about carving out space in, what later will be seen as a declining Ottoman state.
Well, I'm going to want to ask you in a moment, maybe about that era of British, French, Russian kind of patronage, you might say, and undermining the sovereignty of Ottoman governance by having patronage and claiming patronage over these different religious minorities of the East. That recalls that question that we had about the the famous article by Jonathan Riley Smith about crusading as an act of love, because it was an act of charity in order to protect Eastern Christians that they had a special responsibility for, that we were sort of talking about, and humanitarian intervention. But before we get to that, just to come back a little bit to another moment, an episode you mentioned, but I wanted to ask a little bit more about as we go forward and think about what's happening in the Ottoman Empire and Jews and other religious groups in the Ottoman Empire as a major contrast to what we were discussing in that European landscape of, religious purification that turns into a kind of racial, ethnic and racial purification of political space and political rights. Is that episode you mentioned that, as a consequence of the expulsions and forced conversions that are part of, the unifying of most of the Iberian Peninsula and the two Spanish kingdoms in 1492, Castile and Aragon and so on, that there was Muslims were subjected, over the course of a couple of hundred years, but all the remaining Muslims in the in the peninsula, in the Emirate of Granada, are now subjects to these Spanish monarchs, are ultimately forcibly converted and not accepted and integrated. They're always regarded as outsiders. But there was expulsion of Jews. And you mentioned that Bayezid II, Ottoman emperor, welcomed them into the Ottoman Empire. Perhaps we could talk a little bit more about what were the kinds of conditions of religious groups and minorities in the Ottoman Empire. We've alluded, to medieval Islamic kind of conditions of incorporation in various ways as part of this Mediterranean-wide pattern, but maybe it's worth as a backdrop to understand a little bit more what was the kind of pattern, of religious minorities in the Ottoman Empire, and why did they welcome all of these Sephardic Jews from the Iberian Peninsula?
The Ottoman, patterns of conquest actually replicate in many ways the earlier patterns of expansion of the Arab invasions. Because they were not intent on mass conversion, and slowly grew out of, over several centuries of these smaller states that were sort of nestled to the east of the Byzantine Empire. And whenever they took a city, they didn't, again, forcibly convert the population. There would be Greeks living there. There would be Armenians living in their midst as well, and they were part in many ways. The conquest of the Balkans again was very similar to that of the conquest of Andalusia. They were invited in by rival Christian groups in the same way as the North African Muslims came into Spain in 750. So you see this kind of expansion, and in that case, it's also in tandem with Sufism. Sufism plays a major role in sort of forging out, creating new beachheads, cultural beachheads, and slow conversion processes, especially in Southeastern Europe and in parts of what is today Western Turkey. So you have this pattern that's established before the Ottomans even get to conquer Constantinople in 1453. And at that point, yes, they converted many churches into mosques, but they left many in place. And in many respects, they replaced the Byzantine arrangement with the Greek Church, where the Sultan took the place of the Byzantine emperor in even appointing or recognizing the head of the Greek Church. So there are many ways in which they inserted themselves in this situation. So there was an established pattern there in place in 1450s. And as they expanded, I would almost argue that they maintained that polytheistic, multi-religious frontier as a way to safeguard against the exclusionary nature of Western Europe. And so you see these borderlands that they conquered. They were able to conquer areas in which they were opposed to Catholics, the Bosnian Christians. And so these became borderlands or splinter Christian groups who found themselves, better accommodated under Muslim rule. In fact, at one point, Luther said, better the Turk rule by the Turk than a rule by Rome. There was actually a coin printed like that.
Well, that certainly was the feeling
emblem
of many Eastern Orthodox, that were subjected in places like Crete or whatever under Venetian rule to, they preferred the Ottomans, to the.
Well, and Greece and the Peloponnesus, yeah. So this is a situation, there were indigenous Byzantine Jews, there were Arab Jews in the areas after early 16th century that were conquered: Syria, Palestine, Egypt.
And Iraq.
But Iraq came later, in the 1550s.
In 1550s, but a huge Jewish population.
Yeah,
there.
huge Jewish population in Baghdad. So in when the Jews were being expelled from Spain, which clearly was a policy that was timed with the conquest of Granada, that it was clearly an ethno-religious policy. Now we're going to tackle Muslims. We want to get rid of the last of the Jews. And it wasn't just, as people have argued, for the sake of, facilitating the Inquisition and confining converted Jews, but it was because of this feeling that we have yet another population to assimilate, and they eliminated them. And I think also to intimidate the Muslims, and saying this is the alternative, right? And and a few years later, they forcibly converted all the Muslims. So you have this mass migration in 1492 that really was a miserable situation, but Jews did not go directly to the Ottoman Empire. They went in stages. But the Ottomans were very aware of this. They were very aware of what was happening in Andalusia. They would be very aware when the Spaniards went to expel Muslims in 1609. And they actually tried to figure out some way where they could coordinate with the Protestant provinces to the north of what had been, part of Habsburg Spain, and make a sort of common front against Catholics. So they were very aware of this religious dynamic within Europe, and I think had a lot to do with, in addition to a sort of principled relationship that owes to Quranic values about non-Muslims, but particularly people of the book, other monotheists, but was conjoined with a pragmatic politic toward a multi-religious state. And so when Jews found themselves, without homeland, some of them trickled into Italy. There were many who settled there. There was eventually a larger wave that went into the Ottoman Empire, and they were resettled in cities where the Ottomans felt that they could breathe life into cities that had been depopulated, had once had large Greek populations. And one of those, the most important of which, is today called Thessaloniki, Salonika, according to the Ottomans. And for many centuries, it had a Jewish plurality. It had more Jews in one urban center than any place on earth. And then there were communities in Istanbul and Izmir. And then, as I said, and it's these Sephardic communities that eventually basically overwhelmed the earlier Greek Jews, who were smaller in number and lacked that kind of influence. And many of these early Jews who came there, especially those who had mercantile connections, served the Ottoman Sultan and the Ottoman court directly in a variety of different capacities. But one more thing I want to say there, because I think the Ottomans always had their eye on this persecution that was going on in Europe, whether it was Protestants in Hungary. They were very much involved in the Reformation. They recognized that they could find allies among Protestants, but they also,
and other groups like that.
Yeah. But they also, and I think this map that you will see later on, that was done by the Sephardic Jewish community of the Ottoman Empire in the early 18th century, probably had to do with some kind of petition to help co-religionists in the Habsburg Empire, because in the 1730s, the Habsburgs were about to expel the entire Jewish community of Prague. And according to one Austrian historian, it was a letter from the Ottomans that dissuaded them, because they said, look it, and you clearly, there was a Jewish influence, a Jewish petition going to the court. But why are you expelling these people who are, bring prosperity, are hardworking and stuff like that? And if you don't want them, we'll take them. We'll take them again. I mean, they make reference to the expulsions in Spain. In fact, that's a refrain that you see go from this period onward in Ottoman history and in Ottoman Jewish history.
That's interesting. So you're suggesting, in a way, that it does become part of Ottoman self-conscious political culture, that we are more tolerant and receptive to Jews who are being persecuted in Europe, and if they want to leave, they could come, to the Ottoman lands.
Protestants too.
That's right. Interesting.
Too.
Protestants in the wars of religion.
Huguenots will find their way to the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century. Hungarian Protestants, and then in the 1840s, 1848, the Ottomans take in the refugees from the revolutions, and from the Balkans, from Hungary, from Germany, and some of them will stay on, convert to Islam, or become part of the Ottoman administration. So it is,
So you're saying there is a pathway of revolutionary left to Muslim that happened because 1848, those were major revolutions that are a
yeah,
very
those were
important
major
part of, yeah.
revolutions. Yeah, and those refugees, Italians, the Ottomans were one of the, one of the countries to which, in trying to rid this population of revolutionaries, they appealed. So there was actually thousands of migrants into the Ottoman Empire after 1848, and in these multilateral negotiations about sort of removing the revolutionaries from Europe, and putting them someplace else. So yeah, I mean, the other thing I have to say that I think is very important is because several things happen because of the nature of, the anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim persecutions that happened from the medieval period, from the First Crusade onward. The first is Europe is eventually, purged of all of its indigenous Muslim populations, up until the Balkans. The Balkans remain, because they're under Ottoman rule, from the 14th century onward. So there's no more Muslims except in one condition, which is as, um, slaves. Yeah, and particularly as galley slaves. The second is that Jewish populations, are not in Western Europe. They are completely, the French expel them, they allow them to come back, then they expel them again, then there'll be small communities in the south in some of the trading cities. But Italy will be an exception, and will ghettoize their Jews, whether it's in so-called cosmopolitan.
That's the
Yeah,
reason why it's famous for having the new institution of the ghetto, is because
yeah,
they're
it
almost
comes.
the only place where there's still Jewish communities, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and in Germany, but there'll be repeated, purges during the 1350s. There will be mass murder of the Jews, during the bubonic, plagues, and what eventually happens from the 14th century onward, and then Spain, which has a huge Jewish community, forcibly converted in 1390s, expelled, 1492, the rest subjected to the Inquisition, is this migration eastward to Eastern Europe. And again, I think it's no coincidence that Eastern Europe remains more diverse because of the pressure of the Ottomans on their borders. And so the majority of the, Jewish communities of Europe are not in the West at all after 1500. They are in Poland and in, these areas between empires.
Ukraine,
And
which means frontier.
yeah, these frontier, there'll be mass murder in the 16th and 17th century. There'll be pogroms, and it's after those pogroms that the Ottomans conquer that part of Ukraine slash Poland, Podolia, and are welcomed by the Jews as saviors. Um, so, what we're talking about. Wait one sec. Sorry. The European Jewish community is not a Western European Jewish community. That's a sort of fallacy. It is an Eastern European. The majority of Jews are saved by moving east and end up in sort of Greater Poland, if you will, Ukraine, Lithuania, these regions, because of the steady mass murder, looting, expulsion, accusations of,
Well poisoning, spreading
yeah,
plague. Yeah, we have
and yeah, the blood libel,
host
yeah,
desecration, blood
host
libel. I
yeah,
mean,
and it
yeah,
just,
it's
yeah,
a
and that
phenomenon.
happens in Poland too, but the vast majority are protected by the decentralized Polish state, and it's many, lords who have these large areas of latifundia and, require a sort of more urbanized, presence, that they find, utility in these smaller Jewish communities, that work within the second feudalism, but in this region. I mean, the Spinozas are a minority of a minority.
Right, right. Well, and they are actually some of the. That's just because of the unique nature of the Low Countries, Dutch republics, and many of these are, of course, communities who are Sephardic who actually fled. And if they didn't end up going to the Ottoman Empire, as the vast majority of them did, they, in small scattered communities, found some refuge in a few enclaves within Western Europe that had very unique or different kinds of conditions. So that's, I think, the point. I mean, what I'm gaining, from this, I think the conclusion, for this part of our discussion and the end of this episode is really to pay attention to the fact that there's a longue durée history here of persecution of Jews and Muslims who are being excluded, marginalized, forcibly converted, then still cannot be incorporated and are expelled even post-conversion, and that most of the Jews from kind of Western Europe, where they've not been forcibly converted or slaughtered, have basically moved and migrated to areas and territories in Central and Eastern part of Europe, where
Eastern Europe,
let's say Eastern Europe, where there is more of a dynamic of toleration, or at least the persistence of these communities. They manage to survive because there is very close a model that is rather different in terms of how religious minorities are incorporated into society in the Ottoman Empire as the example, that puts kind of a political pressure to accommodate, because otherwise these valuable populations might just, welcome Ottoman rule and actually collaborate with them, or migrate to the Ottoman Empire.
I have found evidence in the Ottoman archives of Jews actually either provisioning or even as spies for the Ottomans in the 17th and 18th centuries. There's a great deal of sympathy for Ottoman rulers.
Well, Eliyahu Kapsali, chief head rabbi of the Romaniot community in Crete, is, busy dreaming of the Messiah, and he thinks that might be the Ottoman Empire who's going to come and save them from this Latin Catholic oppression that they're living under. And, what you might say is that the long period of history of persecution begins with the false charge of Jews being allies of the Muslims and ends up creating a self-fulfilling prophecy because of persistent hundreds of years of persecution, that there are some cases of Jewish communities in Eastern Europe that see the Ottomans or eastern part of the Mediterranean, who see the Ottomans as a hopeful possibility for a more liberated condition for themselves after suffering a millennia or more of harsh anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish suppression. So I think we're going to have to move and talk in a moment in our next episode about what is the prospects for liberation and emancipation of the Jews in the modern period. How did that go? I think that's an important part of the story that you have something to say about.
Okay, thank you, Adnan.